In this video, I want to go over the equipment that I like to use with a bladed jig or a chatterbait, the rod, reel, and line configuration. Now, with that being said, I think that the #1 question I get asked on both this channel and on Bass Fishing HQ is, hey Tyler, what equipment, what rod, reel, line do you go with when you fish X lure, whatever that lure may be? Now, I'm thinking about making this into a whole series where I go through, today chatterbait, maybe I go through jig and Texas rig or crankbait and just go through each kind of lure out there and tell you exactly what I like to use for the equipment. If that is something that interests you, please let me know down below in the comments. I don't want to feel like I'm just selling to you, and that's kind of how I feel sometimes when I'm talking about rod, reel, line. So anyways, if this interests you, if you want to know this information, let me know down below in the comments. Otherwise, this is going to be the one and done type of thing. So, all right, before we get into the chatterbait equipment, this video is brought to you by my apparel company, Finn Fishing. Today is the last day of the June special, which means you can get a USA made sun shirt, a pair of sun gloves, and a wooden bass badge, all for $84 plus free shipping. So you're gonna save over 20 bucks, and it is the best way to help support this channel. It's really simple. All you gotta do is add the sun shirt you like to cart, add the sun gloves you like to cart, add the hat that you like to cart. It will automatically discount at checkout. I will leave links down below, and I greatly appreciate it. All right, let's talk about the chatterbait. The chatterbait, the bladed jig, this to me is one of those lures that I kind of went through a process of trying to really dial in the equipment that I like to use with it. And it took like a little while, because when I first got into chatterbait fishing, I used one thing, then I kind of switched to another, and now I ended up with kind of where I am right now. And so anyways, let's go ahead and talk about it. And the first thing that I'm going to start out with, and what I think is probably the most important component to the chatterbait, is the rod that you use. The rod is very, very important. Now, if you look at a chatterbait, it is a single hooked bait. To me, it's kind of like a jig. I mean, they do call it a bladed jig. But with that being said, you use this on a lot different rod than you do a jig, or at least I do. And the reason that I say that, I'm not saying that you couldn't use it on your jig rod. That is something that I did. Like I said, I went through a process. When it came to the rod, when bladed jigs came out on the market and I first started throwing them, I just used my jig rod, which is typically like a 7.2, a 7'3", kind of medium, heavy power, fast action rod. And I use that a lot. And guess what? I caught a lot of fish on a chatterbait with that rod. I had some good success with that rod. But something that I noticed, and it took like a couple of years to kind of just notice this and figure things out, is that I would lose fish from time to time with that rod. And I also just noticed that the way that these fish were hooked was like not great. Like I realized a lot that I was hooking fish like right on the tip of the mouth. And this is actually something that's really good to take into consideration anytime that you're fishing. But one thing I noticed is that these fish were really hooked a lot kind of on the tip. I would have some skin hooked. A lot of times, this is the big thing that I noticed, I would flip a fish into the boat and I would either lose them on that flip, or they would land in my boat and they would come off. And so that was just something that over the course of time, I noticed that it continually happened. Now, with that being said, I still landed a lot of fish with that jig rod. But with that being said, after noticing that, I really kind of dug into, some of the best chatterbait fishermen in the world and what they liked and kind of why they liked it. And every single one of like the best chatterbait fishermen in the world really like what's known as a composite rod. Composite rod means it's made out of both graphite and glass. Now, a glass rod, like a true glass rod, tends to have a very slow bend to it. It has a very parabolic bend to it. But when you're using glass, when you're using fiberglass, you also lose a lot of feel. And glass rods tend to be really heavy. Like they're just a heavier material. And on the flip side, graphite is very light, it's very sensitive, but even though you can get graphite rods that have more moderate bends and even slow bends to them, there's just nothing that's gonna perform quite as good as glass. Now, with that being said, a number of years ago, they came out with a composite rod, which is kind of a 50-50 blend of the two. So this kind of has some characteristics of both of them. So one thing that you're gonna notice, these rods, this particular rod that I'm using, which this is the Arc Tharp Series B Hit Day rod. This was literally made for chatterbaits, is that this particular rod bends really good all the way through. It has more of that moderate fast bend to it. And that is very important when it comes to fishing a chatterbait. And this is what I think is one of the biggest reasons, is that when you are bringing this bait along, a lot of times fish are gonna hit it as you're reeling it or as you're moving it fairly quickly through the water. Now, if you think about a chatterbait coming through the water, making all kinds of vibrations, when a fish opens its mouth, if you're using a graphite rod, you tend to feel that fish bite that lure a lot quicker than you do with a composite, and especially with a glass rod. And the reason is that when a fish bites a chatterbait, it opens up its mouth, it creates a negative pressure in its mouth, and when it opens its mouth, it literally draws the bait into its mouth. Now, when that bait starts to move almost backwards, you know, as you're bringing along, it starts to slow down. With a graphite rod, you really feel that slowing down, you know, and that is what can cause you to set the hook a lot of times. And if you're setting the hook, seconds really matter. And with a graphite rod, you feel it very quick, you set the hook, and you tend to get those fish hooked on the tip. Now, you're gonna get a lot of fish in the boat, but I feel like when I made the switch to a composite rod, which has that slower action to it, a little bit less feel, but still, I still have good feel with it, you feel that bite just a hair slower. So when a bass opens up its mouth, all of a sudden it can draw that bait in a little bit further before you set the hook. And therefore you are getting that bait down that fish's mouth and really kind of on the roof of its mouth, which is a great place to have it hooked. As soon as I made the change to that composite rod, this B Hit Day, which is a 7-foot 4-inch medium heavy power rod, I noticed right away these fish were hooked really good, really deep. Every time I picked up a bladed jig, no matter what type of bladed jig it was, I was hooking them very deep. So to me, this has become the best chatterbait rod for me. It works really, really well. I feel like I lose very few fish on a chatterbait. Like if I get bit, I set the hook, I hook up, that fish is in the boat almost like 10 times out of 10. Like I feel like I have a great hookup ratio. Now, the next most important component to that, to me, is your line. Now, I use straight fluorocarbon line, and I use 20-pound fluorocarbon line most of the time. I will switch to 15 to 16-pound line if I'm wanting to fish a chatterbait a little bit deeper. But for the most part, I'm fishing a chatterbait in pretty shallow water, and I'm fishing it around a lot of cover. So I like to have 20-pound fluorocarbon. Now, with that also being said, 20-pound fluorocarbon doesn't have as much stretch as 20-pound monofilament. And this is something that is really, really important to take into consideration because fluorocarbon has a little bit less stretch than mono, that kind of works well with having that rod that's a little bit more of a moderate action, more of a bend. Now, if I went to 20-pound mono with this rod and had more stretch and a little bit softer rod, I think the whole system has too much stretch. It has too much give at that point. So if you are a guy who likes to throw monofilament, you actually may be okay fishing a jig rod, that faster action rod, because you're gonna have more give and stretch in your monofilament. So just keep that into consideration when you're out there fishing, because some guys hate fluorocarbon, some guys hate mono, it's all over the place at times. So what I think is really important is to make sure you cater your rod for the line that you're using. To me, very, very important to understand. And the biggest thing that you can do, like I said earlier, always check to see how that fish is hooked. If it's hooked really well, if it's hooked really deep, then you're good. You're probably doing what is right. Now, if you are losing a lot of fish, you need to change something in your system. You can start with line, you can start with rod. There's a lot of different things that you can do. So let's talk about the last part, and to me, that is the reel. This is an Arc Gravity 5 reel. I think it's $159-ish reel. This to me is the best casting reel that I have ever had in my life. And I've owned almost every single brand. I mean, Abu's, Daiwas. I've had so many different brands, And this reel, I have been blown away by over, especially this year as I've been using it a lot. Like there's no reel on the market that casts quite as good as this that I have used. So also take that in consideration. Now with that being said, I started fishing a lot of chatterbaits with like a 6 point something to 1 gear ratio. I now pretty much solely fish a chatterbait or bladed jig with a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio reel. To me, that is the perfect all-around ratio. I can fish a chatterbait slow. If I'm fishing it in the winter and I'm trying to creep that bait kind of along the bottom, I can fish it slow. I can also fish it very fast. In the summer, I'm fishing a grass flat. I'm bringing that bait. I'm keeping it above the grass. I can really fish it fast. So to me, a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio reel is perfect. And that is kind of the whole system that I like to use with my bladed jigs. So guys, that's pretty much it. One other thing that I want you guys to know, I guess, is that drag. I'm just going to try to think of everything when it comes to these equipment things. I lock my drag down. Like my drag is pretty much locked down. Like I can't even really, I can, but it's very difficult to pull it out. Again, there's enough give in the rod. And if you hook into a really big fish, a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pounder, sure, you can probably just crank that drag down if you want. I personally just click the thumb bar and play it with my thumb. That's just the way that I'm very comfortable with. So anyways, that's the rod and reel equipment for a chatterbait. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Let me know down below, and I will see you guys tomorrow.